Golden Black Live here, and Alan Karpick being joined by Brian Neubert and Tom Dienhart, and a Friday afternoon that lot going on is Purdue just gets a commitment here a few minutes ago, or a transfer, I should say, from portal. A lot waiting on also, guys, with respect to the defensive coordinator. Brian, maybe fill us in a little bit. This is somewhat breaking in terms of the commitment, what we're dealing with here this afternoon.
Yeah, Purdue just landed Joseph Anderson. He's a defensive lineman from South Carolina. He's from Tennessee, but he went to South Carolina. He was right around the top 100 nationally overall by Rivals.com at high school, 6'3", 275. Very highly recruited player out of high school. Obviously, would seem like a talented guy. Obviously, their second transfer from the SEC in a matter of days. So Purdue's getting some talented guys here, it would seem. I assume they're both going to be immediately eligible because transfer reform is coming down the pike here pretty soon. I assume that will take effect for next season. Purdue adding some talent here. Don't necessarily know what system they're being recruited to because Purdue doesn't have a coordinator right now, but obviously Purdue is going after some needs here in recruiting, as we fully expected them to do, and has gotten some guys with, at the very least, physical ability here.
Yeah, Tom, you talked about those needs, and obviously D-line, linebacker on down the line. Those are certainly seem to be front and center. If you're putting together a wish list and you're Jeff Brom, these kind of positions you're going to need filled. One would think ASAP for the 2021 season.
Yeah, there's a lot of spots on that defense that could use an injection of veteran talent. Purdue finished last in the Big Ten in sacks. I think they had just 5 in 6 games. Of course, Karlaftis only played 3 games, probably only 1.5 of which he was healthy. So they got to get after the quarterback better. Maybe the Anderson kid from South Carolina will help get some heat. He is a defensive end by trade, it looks like. D tackle too, fellas. If Anthony Watts and Lorenzo Neal both leave, which I probably think is going to happen, you lose 2 pretty big-time D tackles in there. And, how about cornerback, too? I mean, that's been a spot with this massive attrition the last couple of years. I want to say at least 4 to 6 transfers at the cornerback spot after the last 2 seasons. So you have Corey Trice, Dedrick Mackey, and then what? So, yeah, I got to think the shopping is going to continue for Purdue here in this transfer portal.
It's interesting, and Brian, and you guys have both been paying attention to the defensive coordinator search, but is this tipping any hand at all in terms? I mean, obviously they have a defensive backs position available. We hear it's sooner than later that the defensive coordinator is going to be named, but we don't know. But anything we can glean from that, just based on the 2 most recent commitments, does that mean anything? And from that standpoint,
the people on staff now are the ones recruiting these transfers. I assume they're just looking at players they like. Obviously, in this case, there is a defensive line coach on staff now, so he can credibly evaluate defensive linemen. And then when you figure out what you're doing systematically, you just kind of have to make it work. I don't know, what kind of system there could be out there where a 6'3", 275-pound defensive end doesn't come in handy. Linebackers are kind of linebackers. So I don't think there's a whole lot to be gleaned from it other than the fact that Purdue has to get moving with this because it's not like things move fast enough in the portal era here where you can't just kind of take 2 weeks off just because you don't have a coordinator or else you're not going to get anybody. Now, the other part of this, too, is these guys, obviously, you're going to have to onboard them, too, when they get here. Obviously, a transfer is a little more physically mature than a freshman, but in a lot of ways, they're also still kind of freshmen. So they're going to be starting from square one, too, with this new system, but so is everybody else on that defense because there's a new system coming in, obviously.
I got a dumb question, and for either one, I'll start maybe with Tom. But I'm making the assumption that these guys also will be in on January 18th for class. I mean, is that a fair assumption, or is that a not a fair assumption?
I have no idea. I would think so. I mean, you want to
spring ball.
Yeah, you want to get them on campus, like you said, get them going through spring football, learn the new defense, get acclimated with their teammates, and to Purdue. you can get their feet on the ground before in the summer. So yeah, I would think that that's the intent, is to get these guys here in the next whatever week or two when the classes start. I think a week from Monday.
Yeah, week from Monday, I think is where it's supposed to. Brian, go ahead.
We haven't talked to either of them yet to find that out specifically, but they're not graduate transfers. So it's not like they have to wait till the end of a semester. I don't know of any kind of complication there where they wouldn't be able to come mid-year. They're just traditional transfers. So it's not like they have to finish out X number of classes or anything like that in order to get their degree and graduate. So I would assume they will be here this month.
Yeah, of course. I think, like I said, Purdue's classes begin a week from Monday or Tuesday. I'm not sure if it starts on MLK Day or on the 19th, but right at that point in time, classes begin. No spring break, I think, for Purdue this year as well. So they'll run it through to the end of the semester, as I understand it. So you know, it is an important time, and obviously a lot of stuff going on in the portal and with transfers. I guess, Brian, from your respect and with respect to covering recruiting, how does this work? I mean, in terms of, you know, being able to evaluate talent, being able to know who's out there. Is it fair and free game to basically contact anybody you choose out there that, or do they have to really, I mean, I know they have to be in the portal, or I guess I assume they have to be in the portal, but it's just an interesting dynamic of how you go about securing this kind of talent.
Are you talking about how we cover it or how coaches do it?
No, how does Purdue
covering it sucks. It's the worst thing ever. But in terms of coaches, it's scary as hell if you ask me, because I mean, look what just happened here the last 2 weeks. Purdue just took two guys, and they're not alone. Every school in the country is doing this. Is you see a name pop up in the portal, you call the kid, you talk to the kid, you evaluate the kid very, very superficially. Maybe you talk to a couple people around him. You never meet the kid in person this year. He doesn't meet you. He doesn't see your campus. He doesn't see any of that stuff. You're making these shotgun decisions. So is the kid. And you really have very little idea what you're getting into here with these guys. This is the way it's been in basketball for a few years, ever since the graduate transfer wire went crazy, is guys just get over-recruited like crazy because they're there, they're available, and you know, you don't know how good the marriage is until you're 6 months into it, when a kid gets to your campus and all of a sudden you find out really what you have on your hands. But it is a really dangerous situation, but it is one where it's the reality on the ground now. And it's a situation where the schools that do it the best are going to have a huge advantage. And how you go about doing it the best, I have no idea. But you just kind of have to hope for the best here. Purdue, I'm sure, has done it's as much legwork as you can possibly do on these guys. And I'm not necessarily saying there are any red flags here in terms of them, but I'm just saying generally the whole system is such where you're recruiting a guy over Zoom for 2 weeks. You know, you have very little film to watch because a lot of these guys who are transferring didn't necessarily play a whole lot where they were before. Now, the guys who are proven players who are graduate transferring or whatever it may be, those are proven guys. You have a pretty good idea. But when it's a case like the two guys Purdue took the last couple of days, they didn't play a whole lot last year. They're still young players. So you really don't know for certain what you're getting into here. But that's kind of the nature of recruiting period, is you never know until you have an up-close and personal look at what you've actually signed. So Purdue will obviously hope for the best here. The players will hope for the best here, and but until the two really know what they've gotten into, there is a lot of unknown with this stuff. But there is for everybody, and I'm not saying that there's any issues here with Purdue taking these kids. Or no, I'm just saying these are the conditions on the ground now in college football recruiting.
You know, Tom, you've obviously known a lot of coaches over the years and from around the country. I mean, it's just it is a scrambling situation that will become the word new normal. I mean, that's the nature of all this, of trying to assemble rosters in a very different manner than they were doing 2 and 3 years ago.
Yeah, new dynamic. And, you know, Brian's talked about this a lot in the past, where, you know, all your recruiting is not going to be done on signing day. Obviously, these schools are going to want to maintain a degree of flexibility on their roster for that ability to add guys from the portal in particular. I think it's great. These kids should be allowed to do what they want to do like any other student. And the school's got to figure it out. The good coach is going to figure it out. The bad coach is going to make excuses. That's the way life usually goes, isn't it? And it's exciting to see players, of this caliber, 2 SEC players coming to West Lafayette, guys. The linebacker, the defensive end. I mean, instant help. And I don't know, Brian said this comes with its peril. Not really developing a relationship with these guys, but like he also talked about, I'm sure they turned over as many stones as they can. But again, there's always that chance. But guys, isn't there even a chance with these freshmen when they sign them too? I mean, how many of these guys pan out? About half your class doesn't even pan out. So the risk, honestly, probably isn't that much greater than what it is, even if you think you have a relationship with a kid for 4 or 5 months. It's just a chance you turn your roster over. It's a chance to get a 4-star defensive end, guys, a 3-star linebacker from Brevard County, Florida to Purdue, which they probably never would have got. Either of these guys coming out of high school, it's a chance to get that type of talent on campus. I'm excited.
Yeah. Brian, you look at this, does it change the dynamic in high school evaluation? Do you have to make the net wider because you want to be more aware of guys? I mean, do you try to deal, in the thought that anybody could become available at a point in time?
Well,
does finishing second become more important now?
What it does nowadays is if there's a kid you really want and he commits to somebody else, you be as nice to that kid as possible when he tells you he's going somewhere else. Because he might bounce right back to you in a year. What this does is I think this narrows the high school field instead of expands it, because so many schools are going to hold scholarships back because they're going to recruit transfers every year. And nobody is going to want a full roster anymore, because when you have a full roster, and this probably applies more to basketball, if you have 13 scholarship guys on your roster, chances are 4 of those guys aren't playing very much. And if they're not playing very much, they're more likely to transfer. So that comes in. I cannot tell you how many aspects of college sports and running college programs this trickles down to. This comes down to when you have players on your campus, on your team, do you coach them like you would ordinarily coach them, knowing they could leave tomorrow and be somewhere playing for somebody else, in 3 months? Do you have that hard conversation with them about, being accountable and explaining to them exactly why they're not playing? Do you yell at them a little less than you did before? I mean, it's just a really tough situation that I would be absolutely horrified by if I were a college football or college basketball coach. I'm all for freedom for the student athletes and control over their careers, but I also worry about the dumb decisions that are going to come from this too. When you can just leave with no ramifications and go somewhere else, all of a sudden you break up with your girlfriend, your coach looks at you funny, you don't like the fact that there's no Qdoba on campus by your apartment, whatever it might be. Kids, how many of us made stupid decisions when we were 18 and 19 years old? And how many of us made even stupider decisions when we were 21 years old? Right? Yeah. And now a lot of these guys, don't necessarily, a lot of them are going to be emotionally and intellectually equipped to make the right decision, but there's going to be a percentage of guys, and I know this because I've been covering basketball long enough to know that most of the guys who transfer during their careers, when they're out of college and it's all over, they understand, hey man, Matt Painter kind of knew what he was talking about here. And, if I had been a little more mature at that point in time in my life, maybe I would have realized that. Now, that's maybe an outlier in that I'm talking about Matt Painter and not somebody who's a little bit, less scrupulous and less honest. But I just worry about the really bad decisions that some guys are going to make here, because there's no guardrail against this. When you know that when you consider transferring and you realize, hey, I have to go sit out a year somewhere, that gives you every reason in the world to sit down and really, really put a lot of thought into it. And I would be worried that would not happen now for most guys. There's just a lot of stuff that this trickles down to, and not a lot of it is necessarily positive for the game. It could be great for a lot of these guys who find better situations than the ones they're in. It's also going to destroy mid-major programs and low-major programs, because their best players are all going to transfer. And But there has never been anything about the NCAA that has been about parity. So I don't think anybody really is all that bent out of shape about that. But again, this trickles down to so many aspects of things in college basketball and college football.
Yeah, going to be an interesting thing that we'll be watching, and you're right, from a coverage standpoint, it's another set of moving targets on a pretty much a daily basis. So I will turn quickly with the last about a minute or two left in the segment, and of course we all have Jim Comparoni from Spartan Mag, and Brian and myself and Jim will talk about tonight's game against Michigan State, and of course Yanni Karloftis also will join Brian and me for segment 3. Of course, Yanni, the 4-star linebacker that will be starting campus class at campus here in about 10 days. But Tom, I wanted to, we know that defensive coordinator can come anytime now. We know we've got some names listed. We've had names listed and boiling over yesterday. Really going to be interesting to see what happens, and it will be telling to some extent of who Jeff Brom's is able to pull in to run his defense.
Yeah, we'll see. It's a big hire, obviously. We've talked about it ad nauseum.
Yeah.
The day that Bob Diaco was let go, fired, or however you want to phrase it. So again, the importance, again, it cannot be understated. 3 defensive coordinators in 3 years, a program that's had 3 losing seasons in a row, program that needs some traction, guys. And again, this coordinator, like I said, you can play a lot of schemes and be successful on defense. It's more important to, to fit your scheme to the personnel there. I think we've talked about that too. You can't do the old round peg in a square hole. You have to look at your talent on hand, see who your players are, what your strengths are, and try to build your defense around that. And the 3 areas of concern, I think we can all agree, are 1, the sacks we talked about at the top of the segment. You need more sacks, more pressure. Number 2, you need more takeaways, right? Again, Purdue's finished in the lower half of the Big Ten takeaways the last 3 years. That's key. And of course, again, the takeaways, sacks, and it's third down defense, honestly. Purdue struggled to get off the field consistently on third down. So those should be the areas of focus in my mind for whoever that new coordinator is going to be.
Yeah, Brian, and obviously Fridays, we've been around this long enough to know that Friday afternoons can be a time where these announcements come down the pike. I'm not going to ask you necessarily if you expect anything, but it's going to be an interesting and dynamic and an extremely important hire.
Yeah, I do know. I mean, I would think Purdue, is progressing with this. I know they would have liked to have something, by the end of this week. I don't know if that was like offering the job to somebody or actually announcing it. I have no idea. But, Friday is not the best time necessarily to announce news if you want that news to get a lot of eyeballs. But, I don't know if they necessarily think that way. I don't know if that's necessarily even important. But, it always turns out to be our luck anyway that 5 p.m. on Friday ends up being a news day. But it is a really important hire. It is, I've always hesitated to call this the most important hire Jeff Brom has to make, because I thought last year's hire was the most important Jeff Brom had to make. Obviously that did not work out. Bob Diaco was a disaster. But now you really can't get this wrong. You got to get somebody who's going to be, who's going to work here. You need continuity. You have replaced a lot of coaches and a lot of really important behind the scenes positions here in the past year. And that's not typically friendly to building a healthy program on a strong foundation. Constant turnover. That bleeds into a lot of different things with your student athlete development, with your relationships, with your recruiting, continuity, all of this stuff, the various systems. You can't have your guys every single year adjusting to change. That's just not a productive situation. And I know that this isn't the way Purdue wants it. It's just the way things have gone. But this is a really important hire, because the coordinator then will set the tone for the entire defense. Hopefully, for Purdue's sake, you can get a defensive staff in here that can stick around for a few years and have some success, preferably. But, continuity is just so important to building a program. And right now, Purdue's continuity has just kind of gone by the wayside.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting storyline to watch. Okay, well, We will turn this over in segment 2 to Brian, and we'll bring in Jim Comparoni and talk again tonight's game, 7 o'clock, Purdue, Michigan State. That will be interesting as well. Then, of course, Yanni Karloftis, Purdue's linebacker, 4-star linebacker, will be on segment 3. We look forward to that as well. And I want to thank our sponsors, XXX, Hilton Garden Inn, and State Farm agent Trent Johnson. So stay tuned for segment 2 on Golden Black Live. We'll be back in a couple of minutes.